Welcome. I am wilderness ultramarathon runner, hybrid athlete, and lifetime martial artist and historical researcher James Pratt. And today we are going to be taking a look at Soviet Special Forces training. Okay. Now these guys they have always fascinated me. Okay. I mean, who isn't curious about the Cold Warriors? You know, the super soldiers from behind the Iron Curtain. The Soviet Union was fascinating in both its secrecy and how advanced a lot of its methods were. During the Cold War, the United States and the West in general had a technological and economic advantage, but the Soviets definitely had the advantage in terms of how sophisticated their training was. So if you just look at like 1970s and 80s era special forces personnel from the Soviet Union, their training is just as advanced, as precise, and as well balanced as any professional athlete you're going to find today. Okay, and that's 50 years ago. So it's really fascinating to kind of take a look specifically at what they're doing, and that's exactly what we're going to do today. So I'm going to start basically with the most obvious thing, or the most obvious element of their training, and that would be kettlebell training. Okay, the last 10 years or so, you've seen kettlebells explode in popularity. They're now one of the most common fitness tools on the entire planet, and the Soviets used them religiously. Okay, however, I should point out that contrary to popular belief, the Soviets did not invent the kettlebell. In fact, in my duties as Wild Hunt's CEO and investigator, I have been blessed with some pretty cool research opportunities, including discovering a kettlebell from nearly 5,000 years ago from what is now Iran. Okay, they were also used throughout the ancient world. A version called an halter was used in ancient Greece. That was like kind of a hybrid between a kettlebell and a dumbbell, but they were used kind of more like kettlebells, not just lifted, but they were swung. They were even used as jumping weights to gather momentum for the long jump and high jump training, stuff like that. So point being, the Soviets did not invent the gyria, as they called it, or the kettlebell. It's been around for a good long time. However, they did use it to great effect, and essentially what they were doing with kettlebells was pretty cool. So they were doing a lot of the stuff you would expect: overhead presses, Turkish get-ups, kettlebell swings, farmer's carries, all that sort of stuff. But they were also doing some pretty interesting stuff. So as you can see here, they were big on exercises like just simply tossing a kettlebell, like back and forth, strength, hand-eye coordination. Additionally, you'll see that they were really big on something called the triple extension throw. Now, that's literally, imagine like a kettlebell swing, but you use all the power in your body to let the bell continue all the way up over your head, and you throw it back behind you. Okay, it's like the perfect full body explosive movement. And a lot of the Soviet wrestlers were big on this, as well as their special forces personnel, their Olympic athletes, and because this is all coming from the Soviet scientists. Next, we have calisthenics training. So calisthenics training has always been a big part of kind of the Soviet training system, and you can see that today in like Russian wrestlers or Dagestani MMA fighters, these people that are still using the old Soviet style conditioning and training, and there's a reason for it. Like, when people talk about bodyweight exercises, generally a lot of people, especially like in the YouTube community, come from the bodybuilding side of things. So they'll talk about how calisthenics aren't great for building muscle, for this, for that. That's not quite true. Or at least it's a misunderstanding of how calisthenics can be used. So when I was in prison, a lot of guys got big using calisthenics. Okay, it just takes a lot of reps. Your diet has to be on point, and you kind of have to know what you're doing. Having said that, is it the ideal way to put on bulk compared to, say, dumbbell lifting or cable machines, a lot of the methodologies that modern bodybuilders use? Of course not. You're isolating muscle, you're pumping it up. That sort of training is designed for that. Calisthenics, however, despite being able to build muscle, is excellent at just making you almost immune to the effects of lactic acid. Okay, so if you're a martial artist, a runner, an athlete of any sort, and you just do not like when your muscles start burning, you start feeling fatigued, get more calisthenics in your life. High volume, high intensity calisthenics, because it just gets your muscle endurance just off the charts. And that's something that, like, again, if you've done martial arts, if you've done any combat training, you know that, like, while it's great to be able to be capable of like singular efforts of maximal strength, being able to lift up 400 pounds or whatever, Most of the time what gets you in combat is endurance. It's your muscles endurance. You get tired, you get fatigued before there's any shortage of like a singular force output that you fail to meet. So calisthenics have always been a big part of the Soviet system. Soviets, because they were such a totalitarian regime, like they had more control over their people, over their soldiers, and the government itself put a lot more funding into developing their military training protocols on the physical side of things. So you're seeing, Soviet special forces guys training like professional athletes for a reason. That's not just a chance. And they had a wide variety of scientists investigating athletic performance for their special forces operators and their Olympic athletes, because special forces, obviously, you want to have the fittest soldiers on the block, but additionally, the Soviets were big on propaganda, and so winning Olympic Games, especially in combat sports like wrestling and stuff like that, was a big psychological victory that they kind of like politicized, used as almost a political weapon. So they put a lot of time and energy and resources into training their Olympic athletes as well as their special forces personnel. Now, speaking of Soviet scientists, this brings up a guy named Yuri Verkhoshansky. And it's a name that has kind of started floating around more recently in athletic training circles because he was a pioneer of plyometric training, which brings us to our next methodology that Soviet special forces used, plyometrics. Now, Yuri was big on depth drop training. So this would be something like a more advanced plyometric training methodology where you start on a higher box, you jump down to the ground, and as soon as you impact the ground, you hop into another leap. And so it's like boom, boom, and you're getting a shock absorption along with a quick stretch reflex of the muscle through this activity. And it is a very, very good way to train your body for both the force output and force absorption. And so Yuri was big on this. This was something that they used with like paratroopers, well, with special forces across the board, but with paratroopers particularly. They wanted these guys to be able to land. If they had to land a little hard or a little fast, they wanted their bodies to be able to absorb it and then to get right into the fight from there. Additionally, training like this made guys really powerful, really explosive. Soviet track and field athletes, there is archival footage of their training that is just out of this world, where it shows how springy and like explosive some of these guys were. And so these were all going back to Soviet plyometric training methods that were used with both athletes and their special forces operators. And this is things like the aforementioned, depth drop to jump. There is little pogo hops, single leg pogo hops, bounding, leaping, single leg bounds, all sorts of stuff, doing it on flat ground, doing it up inclines. And this is just, again, as good as it gets. Like if you want to be fast and strong and powerful, sprint and jump, sprint, jump, and lift. But it's like there's a million gimmicks out there. There's a million things like do this new exercise methodology, do this or do that. It'll make you super fast or jump higher or whatever. No, nothing makes you run faster than running fast, jump higher than jumping high. Okay, there's no getting around that. It is basic hyper logic. So the Soviets nailed that really well on the plyometric side of things, which again is something that even most militaries today aren't integrating in their high-level troops, or at least not in the structured progression that the Soviets were doing. So next we have environment-specific training. Okay, now what we would have is so if you're a Soviet frogman, this would be swimming. If you're a Soviet mountain troop, this could be mountain climbing stuff, grip training, all the specific stuff. One example here that we can take a look at is Soviet paratroopers. They were big on acrobat training. So this is doing stuff like trampoline jumps, synchronized flips, and all sorts of group acrobatics. And this taught them not only to be aware of their own bodies and how to move their own bodies in space, but it also got them used to doing all of these things on the fly and having their brains be able to think, calculate, and observe in the midst of these movements. So I guess we would call it like a physical spatial intelligence. And honestly, I'm not an Olympic gymnast. I have no special knowledge of acrobatics, but that's just kind of cool. I mean, it's like real life ninja training. Although again, for these guys, it was pretty specific. It wasn't gimmicky. It wasn't, it wasn't something they were doing just to look cool or look hardcore, which, let's face it, many militaries around the planet tend to do stuff like that. Next, we have heavy primal training, and this is like something out of a Rocky movie, okay? Lifting stones, carrying logs on your back, carrying logs like giant tree trunks with your unit on your shoulder, doing all of this in the snow, moving uphill, I mean, you name it. These guys also really like using the sandbag. They would do things like sandbag throws and, above all, sandbag carries. Again, over the shoulder, Zercher style, you know, on the back, anything you can think of. And this was just a massive part of their training in terms of just using sticks, stones, sandbags, like the grittiest, most primal stuff around to really just get strong. And it speaks really well of that training methodology because they had all the modern equipment. Like, this is Soviet Special Forces. They have training facilities, they have weights, they have machines, they have all the same stuff, and yet they're still out in the snow lifting stones and carrying logs. And so, again, like, that is strongman style training. That's mental grit, and let's be honest, that's just really cool also. Now that brings us to their martial arts training. Now this is pretty interesting because during the 70s and 80s, some martial arts units around the world, including some in America, were honestly kind of still following the Bushido movement. You know, it's like believing there was like a death touch, or that there was like Aikido was gonna like help you on the battlefield because you could just control an enemy's force against him even when he was coming at you with a machine gun. Like, there was still some kind of weird stuff coming along. The UFC hadn't blown up yet and kind of exposed what works and what doesn't work, and you know. So having said that, there was very little of that with the Russians. They went hard at combat sambo, and if you want to know if combat sambo works, just look at Khabib Nurmagomedov, look at Islam Makhachev, or pretty much any fighter coming out of Dagestan. Combat sambo works. It is essentially a mix of Russian wrestling, striking, and Japanese judo. And all of those things combine really well. And when you train them really hard for a long time in an environment like you find in Russia and before that in the Soviet Union, you get some amazing skill sets from these guys. Additionally, they weren't doing the sport version of combat sambo. They were gouging eyes and striking throats and doing all sorts of crazy stuff. You know, I mean, it's, you know, you're training for a life or death situation on the battlefield, so you're not really worried about takedown points. Speaking of takedowns too, there were techniques that they practiced that were literally specialized takedowns to do on hard surfaces. Like, you're fighting a guy on a concrete surface, you know, you don't want to spike your own head blasting a double. But there are ways you can shoot that'll land and, you know, like, put the impact on him, or put the impact on him in a certain way where you could, you know, increase the chances of injuring him on a hard surface, stuff like that, which is interesting to think about. Like, as a lifelong wrestler, all that stuff kind of, like, you know, it's an interesting facet that a lot of people don't consider, you know. But, and then in addition to, you know, your grappling, your joint locks, your throws, your strikes, they would obviously also do unarmed weapons training, you know, how to disarm someone with a knife, with a pistol, how to fight at close quarters, how to use your empty gun, you know, as like an aid in combat. Like, if they're one of their AKs ran out of ammunition, they could still use the weapon and the sling around them for leverage, for blocking, for stuff like that as well. And then, of course, there is the famous Russian Spetsnaz shovel, which was a, you know, their little combat shovel that they would use for digging entrenchments. And they were also trained to fight with them and even allegedly like deflect bullets with them, although don't try to deflect a bullet with a shovel. That is a very, very, very last resort move, we'll say. Point being, they were trained to fight with almost anything. These were some very gritty human beings. They were exposed to all sorts of difficult training in all sorts of difficult elements, yet this wasn't just like blindly throwing reps and suffering against the wall and hoping to make, you know, hoping to make tough humans. This was scientifically calculated down to every rep set. They put a great amount of emphasis on recovery. These guys, because they were part of a totalitarian government, you know, their lives and existences were pretty heavily controlled, just like those in the you know, Olympic program were. So the result of that is you get some pretty serious human beings and some pretty serious operators. So if you guys have enjoyed this breakdown, let me know, because I'm thinking about doing some more videos on Soviet grapplers, Soviet track and field athletes. There's a lot of different training methodologies that I want to cover from the Soviet Union, because it's just something I've geeked out on. And if you want to make Soviet training part of your own training program, I have linked my Soviet kettlebell program below, which is one of the most popular kettlebell programs of all time, full stop. So if you're into kettlebells or you're curious about Soviet training, Check out some of the links below. I'll hook you guys up. Otherwise, I'll see you guys next time. Stay wild.